So we've talked about female fertility, but let's talk a little bit about ART or assisted reproductive technologies. When we're talking about ART, we're really talking about IVF. For a woman who's using marijuana, it may negatively impact the outcomes. And there are studies that have shown that women who use marijuana may have lower egg retrieval rates, meaning getting less eggs at the time of retrieval, or reduced fertilization rates, and potentially poor embryo quality compared to non-users. The success rates of ART, which is leading to a successful pregnancy, may be a little bit lower as well.
Hi, superhumans. I'm Dr. Mavis Garcia.
And I'm Dr. Wise.
We're two of the physician leaders at Markham Fertility Center, otherwise known as Our Baby, MFC.
As fertility specialists, we've witnessed firsthand the challenges, triumphs, and the myriad of emotions that come with trying to conceive. Whether you're just starting to think about having a baby, actively trying, or facing challenges along the way, My Fertility Podcast will be your go-to resource for honest conversations and a supportive community.
So grab a cup of coffee or tea and settle in, and let's demystify the world of fertility together.
Welcome back to another episode of My Fertility Podcast. So many of you out there requested this topic. Today, we're going to talk about marijuana use on the journey for fertility. We're going to talk about the impact of marijuana on eggs, the impact of marijuana on sperm, as well as what can happen when one uses marijuana during pregnancy and breastfeeding.
I gotta say, a lot of this stuff I didn't know. And it was actually a really great learning experience to see what the research says and what the newest research out there is about marijuana and fertility.
So let's get into it. Marijuana was legalized in Canada in 2018, and actually Canada is only the second country in the world to legalize the use of cannabis.
I delved a little bit into the history of cannabis for interest. It's actually one of the oldest cultivated plants, and there's evidence that it's been used dating back to ancient civilizations. And so there's even archaeological findings that suggest that cannabis was used in China as early as 5000 BCE for its fiber, which we know as hemp, and the seeds as well. And there's also some evidence that it was used in ancient India for religious rituals and as a medicine.
You may want to know that according to Statistics Canada in 2023, approximately 27% of Canadians that are aged 15 years of older actually reported using cannabis in the past year. And in the group between 25 and 44 years of age, the report use of marijuana was 34.5%.
And that's exactly our patient group, right? The 25 to 44-year-olds. These are the bulk of patients that we're seeing in a fertility clinic. The other thing that I thought was interesting is that in the same Statistics Canada report, approximately 6% of Canadians use cannabis daily or almost daily. That was a lot higher of a number than I expected.
Not surprisingly, just because it's what I see in my practice, the use of cannabis is higher among males, which is 7%, compared to females, which is 5%. And it is most commonly used in younger adults as opposed to older adults.
So what is marijuana, right? What are the parts of marijuana? How does it work? Marijuana is a plant. And this plant contains over 100 different cannabinoids. And cannabinoids are these chemicals, essentially, that have effects on our endocannabinoid system, or the ECS. This is a system of receptors that we all have in our bodies. We know that it's in the uterus. We know they're in the ovary. And in fact, you can get exogenous cannabinoids from marijuana, but our bodies make endogenous cannabinoids as well. So our bodies are actually capable of making cannabinoid type molecules that interact with this ECS system. This is where the effect of marijuana can come from. When we think about these cannabinoids, the two that are the most studied are THC, which is tetrahydrocannabinol, and CBD, or cannabidiol, being the most studied.
THC is the most well-known cannabinoid, and it is responsible for the psychoactive effects of cannabis. That's what people talk about when they mention the high. It also has various medicinal properties such as pain relief, appetite stimulation, anti-nausea effects.
Cannabidiol, or CBD, which is another major cannabinoid, it's non-psychoactive, meaning that it does not get people high, and it's known for its potential therapeutic benefits, such as reducing anxiety, inflammation, and for seizure control.
Now, both of these cannabinoids can interact with the endocannabinoid system, which is a system of receptors throughout the body and brain, including the reproductive system.
Now that we've got a little bit of background about what is marijuana, let's get into some aspects about fertility. The first thing, female fertility. We know that the ECS, or this endocannabinoid system, is integral to female reproductive health. And we know that there are receptors in the ovary and even in the uterine lining. Studies have shown that marijuana use can disrupt the menstrual cycle and ovulation. Specifically, THC affects the release of gonadotropin-releasing hormone, or GnRH, which comes from the hypothalamus to the pituitary gland, which regulates the secretion of FSH, or follicle-stimulating hormone, and luteinizing hormone, or LH. You know, I think we actually talked about this stuff in a previous episode of our podcast.
That was episode 2. So go back to episode 2 if you want to know all about FSH, LH, and GnRH agonists.
As we know, FSH and LH are super important for follicle development and for ovulation. When the GnRH secretion is altered, let's say by marijuana, it can lead to irregular menstrual cycles or anovulation, which is a condition where somebody doesn't ovulate at all, and other menstrual disorders.
Now, I wish that we had evidence that was conclusive and clear, but this is a fairly new area of study, especially since it was legalized not that long ago, and in the past, not many people will admit to using marijuana. So studies in humans have produced mixed results. Some research suggests that heavy cannabis use is actually associated with menstrual cycle disruptions, as well as impeding ovulation. However, some other studies have found no significant impact on ovulation in people who use marijuana moderately. Studies have shown that women who use marijuana regularly may experience changes in the menstrual cycle, including shorter luteal phase or more frequent anovulatory cycles.
Another question around the use of marijuana is ovarian function. As we have talked about previously, a person who's born with ovaries is going to be born with all the eggs that they're ever going to have, and that's your egg reserve or your ovarian reserve. We know that every egg that's in your body has been there from before the moment you were born. And so when we talk about things like cigarettes, for instance, we always say the impact of smoking cigarettes has longer lasting effects because those eggs are sticking around. They're not going anywhere. They're not regenerating. They've been around through all of life's ups and downs, if you will. And so animal studies, meaning where they are doing scientific studies specific on animals, they have shown that THC can negatively impact the number and the quality of eggs. For example, there was a study on female rats that found that chronic THC exposure led to significant decrease in the number of mature eggs and impaired the ovarian function. In humans, the impact on ovarian function is less clear, but it is potentially significant. Studies have shown that there can be reduced ovarian reserve and some altered hormone profiles in women who use marijuana regularly, suggesting that there's probably a detrimental effect on fertility.
We know that cannabis have been associated with increased oxidative stress, which can harm cells, including the precious egg cells or oocytes. And we also know that higher oxidative stress levels in the ovaries can negatively impact ovarian reserve. So while studies in humans haven't conclusively shown the impact of marijuana on ovarian function, the animal data does show that there is likely a negative impact of marijuana on ovarian function, including quality of the eggs as well as the quantity.
Another critical step that we think a lot about here in a fertility clinic is the implantation of the embryo into the uterine lining. If you go back to episode 11, we had Dr. Chan, who talked to us all about the endometrium and endometrial receptivity and how important the lining of the uterus is. The ECS is actually involved in regulating this process, and there is some evidence that marijuana use can interfere with it. When we look at studies in rodents, there's evidence to show that exposure to THC can lead to altered uterine receptivity and impaired embryo implantation. It also shows that THC can negatively impact the window of implantation, which is, again, that period when the endometrium is optimally prepared to accept an embryo, or as I often talk about it, where the endometrium is most sticky to an embryo.
Now, data on humans is limited, and you can imagine why this is. It would be unethical and very impractical to do a study where you subject women who are trying to conceive to marijuana just for the purpose of studying this. So we do have the second best, which is observational studies. And this would suggest that in fact, women who use cannabis might have a lower pregnancy rate as well as increased risk of early pregnancy loss, potentially due to the impact of cannabis on the uterus and implantation.
And with those human studies where they're actually looking in vitro, meaning actually looking under the microscope, testing parts of the endometrium with THC, there's been shown that there's actually reduced expression of certain genes, which are necessary for embryo implantation. Again, which kind of leads us to think that maybe there's potentially lower implantation rates and potentially higher rates of early pregnancy loss. So really, we think that THC can alter the uterine environment, making it less receptive to embryo implantation, which may result in decreased pregnancy rates and even increased risk of miscarriage.
The purpose of this podcast is to educate and not to pass any judgment. From a lot of the research on rodents and on the endometrium, it seems very possible that marijuana, in fact, has a negative impact on fertility from the point of view of egg quality, egg quantity, and embryo receptivity and implantation. However, I think it would be fair to share the results of a retrospective study, and this is the American National Survey for Family Growth done in 2018, which looked at 1,076 female participants and looked at them retroactively, which means that after they had the pregnancy outcomes already calculated, they went back and asked them, hey, do you use cannabis or you did not? The results of this study was that there was no association between cannabis use and fertility in terms of the amount of cannabis or the frequency of cannabis use.
At this point, it would be very fair if you're a little bit confused because we are talking about one study that shows that cannabis does cause a problem, and then we followed up and say that cannabis does not cause any problems. And we've kind of gone back and forth with this. First of all, that's because the literature does have really mixed results, and for sure more research is needed and better quality studies are needed as well. And to that point, even though that particular survey study didn't show that it had an effect, it was retrospective data, meaning that you're relying on people's memories and you're relying on people being honest about their use. And so when we think about these types of studies in medicine or in science, we usually will categorize this as a lower quality study or lower quality evidence. So not only do we need to look for evidence to show that there is an effect of something like cannabis, but then we also look at the quality of the evidence and make sure that it's reproducible. And I think that's really where that confusion can stem from at this point.
Yeah, and in these studies, they're notorious for bias because if you believe that cannabis has no impact and you had a healthy baby, and I ask you, do you take cannabis? I'd be like, oh yeah, I took it. Look at me, I have a healthy baby. And if you believe that cannabis is bad for you and you also had a healthy baby, and I ask you, do you use cannabis? You might say, no, absolutely. I never had cannabis, and this is why I had a healthy baby. Mm-hmm. So people's bias really plays a lot into how they answer these questions, in addition to their memory and their honesty.
So we've talked about female fertility, but let's talk a little bit about ART, or assisted reproductive technologies. When we're talking about ART, we're really talking about IVF. For a woman who's using marijuana, it may negatively impact the outcomes. And there are studies that have shown that women who use marijuana may have lower egg retrieval rates, meaning getting less eggs at the time of retrieval, or reduced fertilization rates, and potentially poor embryo quality compared to non-users. The success rates of ART, which is leading to a successful pregnancy, may be a little bit lower as well, leading to fewer successful pregnancies and live births in people who are marijuana users.
Studies in mouse models have shown that exposure to cannabinoids can impair ovarian function, disrupt hormone levels, and affect embryo implantation. And of course, these findings would suggest that there is a potential negative impact on IVF human outcomes.
Human studies are retrospective and observational. So again, they do have those same potential issues and potential flaws as the studies we've talked about earlier. And some human studies have shown that women who use cannabis have lower success rates in IVF treatments. What's really key to point out is that not all studies agree. And there are lots of studies out there that have shown that there's no significant impact of cannabis use on IVF outcomes as well. This variability can be due to the study design, maybe a smaller sample size, meaning that there were less people that they were actually including in the study, which makes it a little more prone to bias. And then, of course, levels of cannabis use, and then the type of cannabis that they use and the route of taking it as well.
Knowing that marijuana use is most common amongst men than women, we should talk now about the impact of marijuana use on male fertility.
Marijuana use has been associated with various adverse effects on sperm production and quality. There are studies that show that THC can reduce sperm count, it can reduce motility, and can reduce the viability of the sperm. There was a study that showed that healthy men who are regular marijuana users had significantly lower sperm concentrations compared to non-users. It's thought that THC exerts these effects by interacting with the endocannabinoid system in the testes, where it can disrupt the normal processes of spermatogenesis.
Besides the impact on sperm production and quality, there is also an impact on sperm morphology. THC exposure can lead to higher percentage of sperm with abnormal shapes. The endocannabinoid system, or ECS, also regulates the production of hormones that are crucial for male fertility, such as testosterone. THC can disrupt the hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis, which can lead to altered production of testosterone and other reproductive hormones. Lower testosterone levels can impair the formation of sperm or spermatogenesis, as well as libido and overall male fertility. Studies have shown that men that use marijuana frequently might have lower testosterone levels, and this, of course, can impact sexual function and libido as well.
When we are thinking about sperm, the sperm is contributing DNA to a pregnancy, and so sperm DNA integrity is important when we're thinking about successful fertilization and healthy embryo development. And so, although there are controversies with using sperm DNA fragmentation as a test to predict fertility, marijuana use has been linked to increased sperm DNA fragmentation, and increased DNA fragmentation may lead to infertility or high risk of miscarriage. A study found that men who use marijuana frequently had higher levels of sperm DNA fragmentation compared to non-users. When you think about it intuitively, this DNA damage can compromise the genetic material that gets delivered to the egg, potentially leading to issues for the pregnancy.
Now, marijuana used by male partners can also affect the outcomes of assisted reproductive technologies, in particular IVF and ICSI. Studies have shown that men who use marijuana may produce lower sperm quality, which can negatively impact fertilization rates and embryo quality production in IVF or ICSI. So despite the mixed information on the studies, we do advise couples undergoing ART to avoid using marijuana to optimize the chances of success.
It's important to also talk about marijuana in pregnancy, because once you're pregnant, this is another thing that can come up about marijuana use in pregnancy. And for sure, this is a way more common question now than 10 years ago with legalization. And the good news is that there's more definitive research about marijuana use in pregnancy, so we can actually make some reasonable conclusions at the end of this, so it won't be as frustrating as hearing marijuana and sperm, I promise.
Marijuana used in pregnancy has been conclusively associated with severe adverse pregnancy outcomes, such as low birth weight, preterm birth, and stillbirth. The placenta, which is what provides nutrition to the fetus, can be affected by THC, potentially leading to a reduced nutrient and oxygen delivered to the fetus. Actually, there was a study called the National Institute of Drug Use, or NIDA, that found that pregnant women who use marijuana were more likely to give birth to infants with low birth weight compared to non-users. Now, low birth weight is a significant risk factor for infant morbidity and mortality, as well as long-term developmental issues, and usually low birth weight is associated with placenta issues, which makes sense because we know that THC can impact the function of the placenta.
And in fact, THC can cross the placental barrier and reach the developing fetus, and can affect baby's brain development and other critical processes. So research has shown that prenatal exposure to marijuana can lead to long-term neurodevelopmental effects, including cognitive deficits, behavioral problems, and increased susceptibility in later life to mental health disorders. Animal studies have demonstrated that THC exposure during the critical periods of brain development can lead to alterations in neurotransmitter systems, which are the chemical messaging systems that work in our brains, synaptic plasticity, which is the ability of the brain neurons to make connections, and overall brain structure.
Studies using neuroimaging techniques have found differences in brain morphology and connectivity in children and adolescents that were exposed to marijuana when they were in utero. These changes can manifest as impairments in memory, attention, executive function. Some long studies as well has indicated that children exposed to marijuana in utero might have lower IQ scores and increased risk for ADHD and other behavioral disorders.
THC is also excreted in breast milk, which can be ingested by the breastfeeding infant. And this exposure can also affect the infant's development and health. And so the American Academy of Pediatrics advises against marijuana use during breastfeeding due to potential adverse effects on the infant's brain development and overall health. THC exposure through breast milk can lead to lethargy, poor feeding, and developmental delay in infants. Now, I don't know about you, Dr. Garcia, but I see a lot of patients who tell me that they are, let's say, consuming cannabis on a regular basis or even nightly, but that they're using CBD or quote unquote just CBD, that they're not taking in THC. I tried to find some studies or literature looking at CBD specifically around fertility and pregnancy and IVF, but there's very few studies looking at CBD specifically. They're all kind of focusing in on cannabis or marijuana as a whole. There's some very preliminary data in just rodents and in vitro models, meaning under the microscope, that's showing that CBD has a very similar effect to cannabis in general, and that it may have a negative effect as well. I think that although we know even less about CBD specifically, we'll find a lot of the similar conclusions coming out over the next few years.
So in conclusion, there are very good studies talking about marijuana use in pregnancy and how it can affect the developing fetus and even have long-term consequences for their children into adolescence and adulthood. When it comes to marijuana use in fertility, both in conceiving naturally and during IVF, the studies are not as conclusive. However, and I'll be honest, this is my personal bias. Of course, everything I do is to help my patients conceive a pregnancy and achieve a healthy pregnancy. And we know what a humongous investment it is when you're going through fertility treatment, whether it's IUI or IVF, or even just trying to conceive, how daunting and scary that could be. I would say if the study is saying there could be a deleterious effect, and there is no conclusive studies to say that there is no negative impact, as a physician, I would err on the side of caution and advise my patients to avoid marijuana use for both male and females while they're trying to conceive.
I totally agree with you. I think that although the studies are not conclusive when we're talking about fertility, there is a lot of evidence, and it kind of makes sense, right? It's logical in the way that it's presented from what we know about hormones and how they interact with each other. And you're right, if you are putting so much of yourself, your partner, your relationship, financial, whatever, on the line, you want to have the best outcome possible. And so really it's best to try and avoid it when you're trying to conceive. Now, the big caveat to that, of course, is that it's dose dependent, right? What I mean by that is that these studies are looking at people who are using cannabis on a regular basis, or who are daily users, or who are using a relatively large amount of cannabis. That does not mean that somebody who smoked marijuana one time every 6 months, that it's going to have some huge negative black cloud on your IVF cycle. It is dose dependent. The more you use, the more that you're consuming, the more that you expose your body to, the higher the risk, of course. So it's all about balance and knowing what the risks versus maybe the benefits are in that situation and making smart choices.
And that's a wrap for today, Superhumans.
If you're looking to connect, get social with us. Follow us on YouTube and Instagram at My Fertility Podcast, or visit us online at markandfertility.com. And don't forget, follow, subscribe, and share your favorite episode.
Thanks for listening to My Fertility Podcast and for being a vital part of our community. We know you've got this.
We're signing off until next Tuesday.
If you found this episode of My Fertility Podcast helpful, please take a moment to head over to the review section and leave us your thoughts. Your reviews and comments are incredibly valuable to us and help guide future episodes. We also welcome you to direct your questions to info@myfertilitypodcast.com.
My Fertility Podcast is produced by Rabbit Media Inc. in conjunction with Dr. Garcia and Dr. Weiss. Music from Mix Kit Raising Me Higher by Ajay Stelino. My Fertility Podcast is not intended to replace any type or variation thereof professional medical, health, or legal advice, nor should the content be taken as medical advice. Please contact your primary healthcare professional regarding any medical questions you may have. The information presented in this podcast is based on the knowledge and understanding of the host at the time of recording. Medical knowledge is constantly evolving, and new research may change the understanding of health-related topics. While we strive to provide accurate and up-to-date information, we do not guarantee the completeness, accuracy, or timeliness of the content. The views expressed in this podcast by guests are not those of the host or the management. This podcast is not intended to impose any type of discrimination. My Fertility Podcast and its management are not responsible for any losses, damages, or liabilities that may arise from the use of this podcast.